Hello again, everybody. This is Dan Clouser, and welcome back to the Journey of My Mother's Son podcast. I'm joined with Ben Oofana. Ben, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Dan. Great to
Looking
join you.
Absolutely looking forward to the conversation. Before we get started, just introduce yourself in your own words. Who is Ben today?
Wow. Having traveled all these years, starting from adolescence, being drawn to Native Americans and peoples of other indigenous cultures, and took off at 17. My car got me as far as Oklahoma, lived in a community of predominantly Kiowa Indians, and was going into the peyote meetings at that from the time I was 17. And that's where I met my mentor, Horace Daukei, who was one of the last surviving traditional doctors among the Kiowa tribe. He passed on portions of his own healing gifts, and then as part of the training, it had me go through the vision quest, which is typically about 4 days and nights, alone in the mountains, no food and water. And so gradually began to develop these gifts of healing, but still just tremendous curiosity. It's struggled in some ways to fit into the modern day world. And so that took me to India, to Sri Lanka, where I spent a lot of time and just lived out in villages for periods and just went native there as well. And then when I was back in the States, just continued with the Vision Quest and then also trained with Shifu Li Tai Liang in the internal martial arts that has its roots in Taoism. So I tend to move between cultures and
Yeah,
feel more comfortable that way.
very cool. What what is it that drew you to the Native American culture in the first place at such a young age, at 17 years old, that you wanted to kind of, seek out and live among them?
Several things. I remember even as an adolescent and seeing people just going to school, going to work, and just the day-to-day life that many people were living. It just felt like something was missing. And this also a fascination with the paranormal. And when I'd hear the accounts of some of the native people from the times past and how they would have these extraordinary visionary experiences when they would go on the vision quest, and a lot of them possessing various gifts or capabilities, paranormal abilities. And there's something about that I found so fascinating. I was just drawn to it. And also, I think it was just a deeper knowing on some level in this. When I spend time among a lot of these ancient indigenous groups of people, there's just a resonance that I feel and a feeling of being very much at home. And so that's what drew me into that.
Right. And you yourself are not Native American, correct?
No,
Yeah. So
just Western European origin,
yeah. So
German, English, all that.
so how were you accepted by the Native American people when first went there when you were 17 years old?
It was a mixed reception. There was, I think, a lot of people who didn't quite know what to make of it or to do with me, and there was a friend of mine here that I got to be friends with that introduced me to the elderly man who took him in. And he says, "Hey, Dad, Ben wants to go in the peyote meetings." And for some reason, this elderly man, Jack, was receptive to me, and he just said, "Okay," and let me come in. And some of the other native elders were, like saying, "Well, don't let him come in." For, and Jack was like, "No, this one is different. Let him come in." And Jack carried a certain authority, so they deferred to him. There were some native people that were pretty harsh, very critical. Just the fact that I am non-native by birth, and so I had to walk a very fine line. I had to be very careful. And but I became so immersed in the culture. I mean, those days I put together my own feather bustles, and I was dancing in the powwow. I had those huge bustles on my back and the eagle feathers, and I would stay out in the sun as much as I possibly could, trying to darken myself. And I guess I fooled a few people. They thought some people thought I was a half breed or something.
Right.
And but no, I just resonated with the culture and it just felt very much at home and and it was in terms of relationships, it was just a lot easier for me to uh like the some of the white girls just didn't quite know what to do with me. They thought I was too something for them. And whereas the native girls or women, I was in that transitional stage from adolescence into adulthood, and a relationship came much easier with them as, you know, we just connected. And then the community I was living in, it was painful for me watching as the native elders, as the years passed and seeing them die and and then the culture go with them. Because I resonated more with the older traditional culture and a lot of the younger people. And it varies a lot depending on the community, but the community I was living in, there was just a lot of heavy drinking and seeing some of my peers dying in car crashes or choking on their vomit after drinking too much and dying in alcohol-related violence. And so because of the crazy dysfunction, I bailed out. And when I found myself, well, first I put myself back in college after I had apprenticed for a few years with this native doctor, Horace, and I also needed a few years to reassemble myself because, he would put me through all kinds of just kind of survival experiences. Like he dumped me out in the middle of the Hopi Indian reservation with $30 in my backpack and with the instructions to hitchhike to Las Vegas, Nevada, to make it the best I could, learn to survive, use my instincts, and I did. It was terrifying. Just having grown up in the evangelical church, I knew what to call churches. I knew what to say, and I got put up in a boarding house and for a while, and long enough to find a job and get a few paychecks. And myself and another guy, we got an apartment for a while. And then my mentor Horace showed up after a few months and said, ready to go. And we were back on the road, cruising between the Navajo reservation and to Oklahoma and, you know, just different native communities in the Southwest. And he'd be treating, working with people. I'd be assisting him.
Right.
But yeah, but after a few years of college and, working with people and I was just having to make sense of the whole thing, like he passed on portions of these healing gifts to me and I was fearful in the beginning, like wasn't sure I knew what I was doing initially, but sometime back Horace said, well, I can't explain everything you need to do. You actually have to start working with people, and this is going to reveal itself to you. And so gradually, I did start working with people and developing greater capacities, developing the ability to look into people's bodies and minds. And I would scan people's bodies. I could see and feel what kinds of issues they were dealing with emotionally, psychologically, physiologically, how they were struggling with different challenges, the resources they possessed when there were certain deficits, where they lacked certain functional capacities. And then as I began to work with people, I began to get a sense of how these gifts that were passed on to me, how they would facilitate healing of certain illnesses or health conditions, or if someone was injured in an automobile accident or sports injuries or whatever. I could sense what it could help, and if there was something beyond the range of what I could work with, I got a sense of that too. And but since that time, I've always been learning, always studying, and just to gain a deeper understanding of various health related issues, and as well as to understand uh, emotional wounding, the trauma that many people carry, and how I could better assist people, and also what other resources that I can share with people to where they could get the help they need.
Yeah. How did you meet Horace?
That was in the peyote meetings. I would be sitting up in the peyote meetings. It's there in southwestern Oklahoma with these native Kiowa elders, and Horace living out on the Navajo reservation with his wife, who was Navajo, would venture back to Oklahoma occasionally, spend time with his own people, come back to assist people on occasion. And I remember at one point he was going to conduct a peyote meeting that was specifically for the purpose of treating one of Jack's grandchildren, a grandson that had some type of blood disorder or something. And I was afraid that Horace would say, well, this is only for Native folks. Get out of here. And I was relieved when, we line up in front of the teepee and we walk around clockwise and we go in, and it's like, wow, he hasn't chased me off. We're walking around the teepee. We're going in. I'm actually sitting in here. It's like he hasn't chased me away. And he actually spoke to me that night during the meeting. Prior to the meeting, when I was talking with my young friend, and Horace is across the hall, and at a certain moment he just stopped and just stared at me with this intensity and uh, with this penetrating gaze. He's like looking right through me. I think he knew in that instance that I would be his apprentice. And so when he spoke to me that night, I think he was just wanting to make contact, wanting to establish that connection between he and I.
Right.
And after that, I was in college at the time, and in the second year of college, my grades were starting to drop, and I think a big part of it was at some level I knew I wasn't doing quite what I needed to be doing at that time. So, with the encouragement of two friends who are also from the Kiowa tribe, George and Tim, it's like I went ahead and approached Horace, and I was, at the time, I was physically shaking. I just said, I want to learn to do what you're doing. And he says, well, what are you doing this weekend? Can you start fasting? And still shaking, it's like, yeah, sure. And he had me drive down into the Wichita Mountains, not eating or drinking the next 2 days and nights. And that time he was just wanting to determine for sure if I was absolutely serious. And so he instructed me to make my way out to the area between Farmington and Shiprock, New Mexico, where he was living with his wife. And then we would begin the training. The training was intensive. I mean, he even from the start, I would go with him, and immediately I became his assistant. Whatever he needed me to do, I'd be building sweat lodges or anything, to assist him.
Right.
Yeah. And sometimes and he never billed himself as a psychic, but I could be riding cross country with him, and you couldn't hide anything from him. It'd be driving, as be riding the passenger seat, and he'd just be describing various events that had occurred in my life as though he was watching a movie, and he could see every detail of it. And times I'd get in an argument with him, he'd rebut my argument before I could get the words out of my mouth. And there were instances like occasionally he'd say like, pull over. And so I would, and he would describe a plant with a certain kind of features. He'd say, walk out in this direction, and he'd tell me where to go. And so I'd go and I would gather the plant that matched his description and come back and say, is this what you're wanting? And so we'd bundle it up and we'd take off down the road.
Wow. So
Yeah.
I'm sure, I know there's a vast amount of differences, but just talk about some of the differences between, Western medicine and indigenous and, what you were doing with Horace.
What I was doing. Because I think too, there's also a lot of different indigenous healers from different traditions. I've had the opportunity to work with a few here and there, but from other traditions as well. But of course, Native Americans didn't have access to the modern medical interventions. And although during the transitional period, there were still some extraordinarily powerful doctors, but there were times where some of these traditional doctors would encourage their patients to also seek out Western medical interventions in some instances. So you look at the advances of modern Western medicine, for instance, and I know some people are suspicious of all vaccines, but you go back, previous centuries and smallpox, cholera, measles decimated the Native American population, and it actually killed far more people than all the warfare did. And tribes like the Mandan were, I think, around 25,000 or so. There were only maybe just under 100 survivors left in the Pawnee.
Wow.
I think only maybe 900 out of maybe 25 to 30,000 people survived. And so there is a place for Western medicine. And I'm not coming up with the best examples just right off the top of my head. I mean, sometimes I have concerns myself about the uh, pharmaceuticals, just having side effects. And so I tend to make that a last resort. I'm not saying I don't utilize modern medical intervention at all, but if you're in a catastrophic automobile accident and your body's torn up, it's it can be much to your advantage uh, to the intervention of, sometimes you need like surgical intervention to put you back together and stuff. And yet I work with a lot of people, for instance, after having undergone surgery, or maybe they were in a serious automobile accident. And let's see, with the surgery, a lot of times the body's own healing intelligence is not um, healing, the incision, you know, healing that trauma resulting from, of the surgical intervention itself. And so I'll work with people in many instances, and um, the surgical wound will heal that much faster. They will recover much faster than they would otherwise. People that were having difficulty healing, sometimes there's some, as you say, toxicity from the anesthetic. And so as I'd work with these individuals, and um, it would flush that toxicity out of their system. You'd have sometimes the individuals after surgery, it is invasive trauma of sorts. And so sometimes afterwards, it would be somewhat dissociated, disoriented. And as I'd work with these individuals, and it would restore their functioning, it would become more clear, more lucid, more grounded within their physical bodies. And, where they talk about the what they call the meridians, like in that they utilize in acupuncture, those subtle energy pathways between the acupuncture points in the Hindu Vedic system. They talk about chakras. I feel that in people's bodies. And say if a woman gives birth via cesarean section, sometimes it will cut through those meridians and it can also do substantial damage to that chakra in the navel region. So as I work with people, it actually repairs that damage, and so again, they're more grounded, more lucid, and their body heals that
Right.
much more readily. But my mentor, when he would work with people, in those days, I mean, they basically took a lot of the native children and they would sometimes send them great distances. I think in his case, I'm assuming, I don't know for sure, but I think he went to one of the boarding schools like the one at Anadarko, which is not too far from where his family of origin lived. And but Horace had a short time of apprenticing with his father, who was an extraordinarily powerful doctor from the Kiowa tribe. And his father's name was Waldo. And so Waldo transmitted portions of his own healing gifts to Horace. Horace was soon thereafter um, shipped off to Europe to fight. He fought in World War II, and to the end of his life, he still had flecks of German shrapnel in his back,
Wow.
from the German artillery. And so he didn't have that much time to learn from his father. I mean, his father transmitted those gifts, and or at least that was my understanding. I may be missing some details because I don't know all of the history, but Horace didn't. I mean, when he came back to the United States, I'm not sure his full work history, but I know for some time he was working as a police officer for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he was a real hard ass. He was pretty rough.
Hmm.
And I think it was his oldest son, Waldo, who was named after his father, was, from what I understand, was seriously ill. And someone had spoken to him and said, "Look, your father passed on that medicine to you. So to see what you can do for your son, what you can do to help him." And apparently it did help him quite a bit. And so that's when Horace really began to work with various individuals. And in that tradition, he too would go on the vision quest. And so Horace possessed a range of these various gifts or healing powers. As I would work with them, there were times we would go into the sweat lodge and he'd work with people. I remember one instant there was a man whose leg was badly swollen, and there was a open wound. It was maybe about 3/4 of an inch, and there was oozing pus. And um, so we went into the sweat lodge, and Forrest was working with them. And when we came out, the swelling had gone down considerably, and he had partially closed the wound. He wanted the individual to come back, I think maybe 3, 4 times or so to further work with them. He was, working with them in installments. It's not just instant flick the
Right.
light switch. It took place in stages. But I saw that first installment. But sometimes in the sweat lodge, you'd feel this extraordinarily powerful presence. It felt like a buffalo crowding into the sweat lodge as I was working with them. Some things I have been hesitant to share with people of outside of that culture, because it's like, well, is he just making stuff up? But
Right.
there were a lot of these individuals who possess paranormal abilities. I mean, you can go to Google and you can type in Hopi snake dance, and you could actually see images of these individuals dancing in the plaza. These men and have a live rattlesnake hanging out of their mouth or just wrapped around their neck and face. And so they're dancing with these live rattlesnakes. You have these individuals who have this extraordinary connection with the forces of nature and could, and I've experienced things in other cultures, like spending time in China, spending time in India, Sri Lanka, other individuals that possess these various gifts or healing capabilities of sorts.
Right.
And so I just keep myself open. I can be very, very skeptical of myself. I need to see evidence. I need to see and experience something firsthand. I don't just blindly believe or take someone at their word or whatever,
Right.
unless I know them very well and know that they have the experience firsthand. But um, one of the first times I saw my mentor working, this young man that had the blood disorder, and so he's laying down on the ground in the teepee towards the front. And as Horace begins to work with him, he puts his hand on the ground, or hands, plural, and this live mole comes out of the ground into his hands, and he sets it on this young man on his back, and somehow that's interacting as part of the healing process. Now, if you go in the university libraries, various parts of the country, and you could find some of these books that were written, say, 1880s and 90s, up maybe to 1930s or 40s. And there were a lot of accounts of these Native Americans, some of their traditional doctors and other individuals that possessed various healing gifts and capabilities. And that's actually part of what drew me, to Native Americans. I would read these accounts, and then when I actually made my way to Oklahoma, and I would sit with this Native elder that I mentioned, Jack, and he would also be sharing these accounts that have been passed down over multiple generations. But yeah, I would encourage you, or anyone listening, if you could, like I said, the book's written between, like, say, 1870s, 80s, up into, the earlier part of the last century. And it wasn't just healing capabilities. I mean, some of them supposedly had the ability to call in the rain during times of drought. There were numerous accounts of individuals in battle that uh, they refer to these gifts or healing powers as medicine. And so there's medicine for healing, there's medicine for warfare. They call it war medicine. And so they had this protection. They would go flying into the midst of the battle, and people would be firing at them, shooting. And there were accounts of, some of them had those war bonnets, and the feathers would be clipped, from the, the bullets,
Right.
hitting the feathers. The feathers would be shot out of the war bonnet, and yet the individual didn't have a scratch on them.
Oh,
They had that protection. So there were numerous accounts, and I watched my mentor do things. It was one example that sometimes we'd make trips up into Nevada, and we'd go into the casinos. He could see which slot machines would pay off, and the first time I went to Vegas with them, and I'd given him a big chunk of money, it was just kind of customary. You offer, if you're going to apprentice, in this culture we study in universities, and you spend a lot of money on tuition, thousands of dollars and many thousands. And so I'd given them, Horace, a few $1,000s, and so the first time we go into Vegas, and he blew all this money in the slot machines. And at that time, I still didn't know Horace that well. It was early in the training, and I thought, oh God, I just made the worst mistake I've ever made in my entire life. And so all this money is disappearing into the slot machines. And he hands me this, what I thought was his last $10 bill. And he said, go get tokens. And I'm saying to myself, effing, a compulsive Indian. And I go and I get the tokens and I return and I had that bucket with uh, the $10 worth of tokens. I shove it into his hands and he calmly hands it back to me and says, follow me. And so he um, takes out a token and puts it in the machine, says, pull the handle, and it pays. And then the next machine, same thing. And it's like each machine, I forget how many machines he did in a row, every single machine in a row paid. And then the bucket fills up with coins, tokens. And by that time, I'm getting really excited. And it's like, let's keep going. It's like, no, it's getting late. Let's go up and, you know, this was in that Circus Casino in Las
Right.
Vegas.
Right.
He said, no, let's go up. It's late. Let's go get to bed. But there is another instance where he's back in Vegas and he figured out which machine, he knew which machine was going to pay. And after so many tokens and then the siren goes off on the machine and they're spilling out all over the floor and the casino employees are coming from different directions. And he just has this kind of grin on his face and they have no idea who they're dealing with or what he possesses. But
Right.
yeah, it's it was a mix too because he possessed extraordinary power I'd never seen to this day. And I've spending time in China and India and seeing healers from Brazil and the Philippines, and I never encountered anybody as powerful as he was. But he didn't know how to work constructively with his emotions. He didn't know how to heal his emotional wounding that he carried. He was, of all the healers I've seen of anywhere, I've never encountered anyone as powerful, as gifted as he was for treating physiological health conditions. And yet, not knowing how to deal with the emotional component. And I've seen this in other traditions, some of the Indian gurus, Tibetan lamas, uh, Sufi masters, Sufi, the mystical sect of Islam. So people develop these extraordinary gifts and capabilities, and that power filters through them, but the fact that they don't deal with their emotional wounding, what
Right.
happens is when that power filters through, sometimes they have their spiritual wisdom or their healing gift, but those dysfunctional, wounded parts in their psyche, that power amplifies them. And so they act out in one way or another. And
Yeah.
so that happened with my mentor. After a few years, it was getting a little crazy there.
Yeah. So what what has been one of the biggest benefits for you personally experiencing all these different cultures?
It keeps me from getting bored. I I need that diversity. If I'm just around the same kinds of people, same ethnicity, you know, same whatever, it just gets extremely boring to me. And I've developed, I'm like a chameleon. I can just move through these different cultures, and I feel very comfortable doing so. And I have developed all these different sides to me that there are ways in which, when I'm back in Sri Lanka, for instance, in India, I could connect with people and I can relate and I could engage from express parts of myself that a lot of people in our, what I call our Wonder Bread culture, in our dominant American society, can't grasp, can't
Yeah.
fathom, can't understand. So I'm over there and I can express different sides of myself. And as far as relationships, it's, romantic, intimate relationships, I find it a lot easier to relate to or connect with women there. And they find it easier to relate to me. I've had longer, more meaningful, more fulfilling relationships with women there. And when I've times in the past where I've tried here in North America, except some of the Native American women, they found me a bit more interesting.
Right.
But
Right.
and there are aspects of myself that I could connect with some of the more traditional Native people. A lot of Native American people are um, they do have a intelligence about them that is I very much appreciate. They're very progressive in their thinking, the ones who are educated, and I can relate to them in many ways that I can't relate to other people, and I have a lot of appreciation for them. And sadly, that a lot of the healing gifts, that medicine, that power that was passed down over the centuries, so much of that's gone. There's some people practicing and stuff. There's still people that do the Sundance and still people who go to the peyote meetings and stuff, but it's different. It's not like it was when I first went into the peyote meetings back, what was that, 43 years ago? I'm
Wow.
older than I look.
Wow.
And yeah, a lot of native elders have died out since then. And there was a magic in the meetings. I mean, just Jack was telling me at one point, there's a time when the spirit comes in the meeting and that he was talking about how you would hear the voice of a woman singing in Kiowa. And it was at one point I'm sitting up in the meeting, Horace is running, and it was just extremely cold. I mean, they had this cold front blasting through. I think the temperature dropped down maybe in the teens, maybe down to zero. It was freezing your ass off if you went outside. Bitter cold wind. And and I'm hearing that voice and I'm just like looking around. It's like, who's where's this coming from? And there were two women in the teepee that night. One was Navajo, and there's no way she would be able to sing in Kiowa. And the one Kiowa woman who was in the teepee, who Horace was treating, when they spoke in English, it's a doctoring. So the elderly woman that Horace is doctoring, no, she couldn't sing like that. And it's like, where's this voice coming from? It's like, oh yeah, that's that voice that Jack was telling me about.
So, Ben, is there anything that you think we missed during the conversation that would be valuable to the listeners?
Wow, there's so many things I haven't even began to touch upon. And so one of the things I do is I teach people how to work constructively with their emotions. It's something that a lesson I learned from my mentor that he never really intended to teach me. And so I think it's important on many levels that, I encourage people to show up present as much as you can in life. One, like, what is it that you most want to do? What do you want to accomplish? What do you want to experience? Where do you want to go? Who do you want to be? And, what are your deepest passions? I think it's very important for people to pursue that.
Yeah.
But also, as you do so, we're all going to encounter adversity of one form or another, and setbacks, losses, people that we know, or don't remember who said it, that you are the only one that you will never lose or leave. And
That's
so,
very true.
people move away, people pass away, and life is constantly changing. And so we have experiences that trigger us in the present, difficult or challenging experiences. As well, we carry emotional wounding, we carry trauma from our past in many instances. And because we carry that emotional wounding trauma from our past and it carries over into the present, we tend to attract people, circumstance, situations to reenact a lot of these past wounding experiences. And so when that happens, there's a meditation practice which I developed many years ago, but it's very powerful. And what I encourage people to do is acknowledge step one, acknowledge what's happening. What is it? Is it a person or a situation, circumstance? Is it an issue concerning you? Is it a medical diagnosis? Is it something happening with your romantic or intimate partner or family member, with your work, whatever's going on in your life, acknowledge it. Step one. Two, what do you feel in response to it? Sadness, grief, anxiety? Is it just uncertainty, concern, a little intimidation? And there's also a whole range of pleasant, enjoyable emotions, excitement, anticipation, but mostly I start people with the unpleasant emotions because that's where they get stuck. There's also feelings like love and affection, all that. But again, we get stuck with the difficult, unpleasant emotions. Three is, where are those feelings situated in your body? In your chest cavity, down your abdomen, in your throat, towards your back. Where do you feel them? And bring as much awareness as you can into that part of your body where the feelings reside. As you do so, with your eyes closed, be fully immersed in what you're feeling, breathing very softly, very deeply, allowing the feelings to be what they are. You're not trying to breathe them out. You're not trying to make them go away. But as you could stay with them and continue to breathe in them, into them from the depths in the middle of those feelings, they go through a process. You start to digest them. You need to digest your life experiences and your subsequent cognitive and emotional responses. As you do so, what happens is it helps you to heal those parts of you that are fearful, anxious, that hurt. There's a diffusing of that emotion. Sometimes it could happen in 15 or even 5 minutes, but if it's extraordinarily painful loss of someone you love, maybe through a death or an accident, maybe you go through a divorce, then that pain can be very persistent. And so we need to be persistent to return to these feelings and continue to do this practice. Sometimes I would do so for hours on end throughout the day. And you can't always sit with your eyes closed, but a lot of times I would be up doing whatever I had to do, cleaning the house, or I could, there were times I was teaching class years ago and I'd have these feelings coming up. I'd still be breathing into whatever I was feeling. I could be driving, I'd be breathing, or walking, I'd be breathing into whatever emotional response was surfacing. But as you do so, it helps you to digest your lived experiences, those charged emotions. As you work through them, they become softer, more diffuse, and it facilitates this growth, this evolution. It helps you to become more flexible, more adaptive. It engages your brain, your mind's creative problem-solving capabilities. So you come up with workable solutions to the issues and challenges that you're facing. So yeah, show up, pay attention, participate. And a big part of that is working constructively with your authentic emotional responses and just fully engage in life. And so that's what I have to share.
Yeah, I think that's so important. That last point for sure is fully engaged in life,
Mhm.
without a doubt. So I love that. Ben, if anybody's interested in digging in more about what you do, I know we just kind of scratched the surface in this interview, but if anybody out there listening wants to reach out to you and find out more about what you do, how do they find you on the internet?
The best way is to go to my website, which is benoofana.com. And yeah, go to my website. I have a YouTube channel where I'm posting a lot of videos on my website itself. On the blog, there are many articles. If you're going through a breakup or divorce, you could download my free ebook. It's gettingoveryourbreakup.com. You can just download the ebook. You can book a free call, refiningrelationships.com. I'll send you those links so anyone could follow up. You'll post those below the podcast.
Absolutely. Yep, I'll put those in the show notes for sure. For sure.
Okay,
So
wonderful. I appreciate that.
no doubt. So Ben, that brings us to our final question. As you know, the subtitle of the podcast is Many Little People in Many Little Places, which comes from the opening lyrics of the Michael Franti song Gloria, which go, when many little people in many little places do many little things and the whole world changes. What's one of the little things that Ben does on a daily basis to make the world a little bit better place?
I do a lot of intensive practice. Having trained from a both Native American doctor and a master from China in all the ancient spiritual esoteric traditions, there's one continually develops their body and mind by doing practice. So the practice that I shared with you just a while ago, most days I'm doing a good 2 hours a day, just sitting, and sounds like a lot of time, but when you consider the amount of time that we spend scrolling on our smartphones through
Yeah,
our social media feeds and watching television, and but in these traditions, like in China and India and among Native Americans, and you'd have people develop extraordinary gifts and capabilities. And the way they did so is through doing this, all this intensive practice. So I'd encourage you to, if you have a chance, work with individuals such as myself, gifted healers. And as I've trained with a traditional doctor, with a master from China. And so there are still some individuals who possess these gifts and capabilities. So do your practice. And if you have the opportunity to take it a step further, do that as well.
yeah, I love it. I love it. Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. It was a great conversation. I'm sure the listeners are going to get a lot out of it. For those out there listening, be sure to check out my other podcasts and blogs at journeymymotherson.com. While you're there, pick up a copy of one of my books. And again, Ben, thank you so much. It was a great conversation.
Thank you, Dan. Very much enjoyed engaging with you here.
No doubt. Appreciate it.